The FBI agent's badge glinted in the morning sun as she stepped out of the black SUV, her hand resting on her service weapon, while 3 more agents flanked my cabin. "Mr. Sterling, you have exactly 1 hour to begin demolishing this structure, or we'll do it for you," she announced, holding up what looked like an official warrant. Behind her, HOA President Margaret Whitfield stood with her arms crossed, live streaming the whole scene to her 5,000 followers, her perfectly styled platinum hair catching the light as she smiled like a cat who'd caught a canary. What she didn't know was that the tiny microphone I'd hidden in my shirt collar was recording every word, and in exactly 58 minutes, her entire world would come crashing down harder than any cabin ever could. My name is Connor Sterling, and 6 months ago I thought I'd found paradise when I bought 5 acres on the edge of Willowbrook Estates, a gated community 45 minutes outside Denver. The realtor had assured me that while my property bordered the HOA development, I wasn't actually part of it, which meant I could build my dream cabin without dealing with their endless regulations about paint colors and mailbox heights. I should have known something was wrong when she kept glancing nervously at the pristine white fence separating my land from the manicured lawns of Willowbrook, or when she mentioned 3 times that the previous owner had moved rather suddenly after living there for 20 years. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week after I'd broken ground on my cabin. I was mixing concrete for the foundation when a golf cart pulled up to my property line, and out stepped Margaret Whitfield, all 5'4" of her radiating the kind of entitled fury that only comes from having too much time and too much power. She wore a coral blazer with a gold HOA president pin the size of a dinner plate, and her voice could have stripped paint when she demanded to know what I thought I was doing. When I explained that I was building a cabin on my own land, she laughed, like I'd just told her the earth was flat, and informed me that according to the Willowbrook Estates expanded boundary provisions, any construction within 500 feet of their perimeter required HOA approval, and I most certainly did not have it. I pulled out my property deed and showed her the clearly marked boundaries, pointing out that I wasn't part of their HOA and therefore wasn't subject to their rules. Her face turned an interesting shade of purple as she snatched the papers from my hand, studying them like she was looking for a loophole written in invisible ink. After 5 minutes of increasingly frantic page-turning, she thrust them back at me and declared that she'd be consulting with their legal team because there was no way someone like me could build that eyesore so close to their premium community. The way she said, "someone like me," made it clear she'd already decided I didn't belong there. Though whether it was my faded work clothes, my 10-year-old pickup truck, or just the audacity of existing outside her control that offended her most, I couldn't tell. For the next 3 months, Margaret waged a war of attrition that would have impressed a military strategist. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she'd position herself at the fence line with her phone, live streaming my construction progress to her followers, while providing commentary that made me sound like I was building a nuclear waste facility instead of a modest 2-bedroom cabin. She'd zoom in on every sawdust pile, every tool left out overnight, every delivery truck that dared to park for more than 5 minutes, narrating each violation like she was David Attenborough documenting the destruction of the rainforest. Her followers ate it up, posting comments about property values and neighborhood character, while suggesting increasingly creative ways to stop my construction. The harassment escalated from annoying to genuinely disruptive when she started calling in complaints to every agency she could think of. The fire department showed up 3 times in 1 week, each time finding nothing wrong with my perfectly legal construction. The health department came out to investigate reports of hazardous waste, only to discover that the toxic chemicals Margaret had reported were actually just paint cans stored properly in my work shed. Animal control arrived, looking for the dangerous wild animals I was supposedly harboring, and seemed genuinely confused when all they found was a family of rabbits that had made a home under my lumber pile. Each visit meant stopping work, explaining the situation, and watching valuable daylight hours slip away while Margaret filmed from her side of the fence, providing color commentary about how these investigations proved her point. The tipping point came when she discovered that the previous owner of my property had actually been a founding member of Willowbrook Estates who'd had a falling out with the board 30 years ago. According to the gossip she gleefully shared on her live stream, he'd sold his house within the development, but kept the 5 acres outside as a final middle finger to the HOA. This revelation sent Margaret into overdrive, convinced that my cabin was part of some decades-old vendetta, and that she was the chosen defender of Willowbrook's honor. She started referring to my property as the rebellion plot, and herself as the guardian of community standards, language that her followers parroted with religious fervor. Things took a darker turn when I arrived one morning to find my construction site vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "Not Welcome" across my foundation in letters 3 feet high, and my pile of lumber had been scattered across the property like giant pickup sticks. My generator, which I'd locked in a heavy-duty cage, had somehow been filled with sugar, and my porta-potty had been tipped over, its contents spreading across the ground in a smell that made my eyes water from 50 feet away. Margaret was already at the fence when I discovered the damage, her phone out and recording as she expressed shock at the vandalism while barely suppressing a smile. She made sure to mention several times that this kind of thing never happened in Willowbrook, and suggested that maybe I'd attracted the wrong element to the area. I filed a police report, but Officer Davidson, who responded to the call, seemed more interested in Margaret's version of events than mine. She'd cornered him by her golf cart, speaking in hushed tones while gesturing dramatically at my property. When he finally took my statement, he kept mentioning how concerned the community was about my construction and how these disputes could escalate if not handled properly. The subtext was clear. I was the problem, not the vandalism. He took a few pictures, filed a report that would probably disappear into the void, and suggested I consider community relations before continuing my project. As he drove away, Margaret waved cheerfully, already posting about how the police had come to investigate the disturbance next door. I spent $2,000 on security cameras after that, installing them at every angle to cover my entire property. Margaret responded by installing even more cameras on her side of the fence, creating a bizarre surveillance arms race that would have been funny if it wasn't so exhausting. She also started a petition on the Willowbrook community website, claiming that my cabin was decreasing property values and attracting crime. The fact that the only crime had been against my property didn't seem to matter. Within a week, she had 300 signatures from residents who'd never even seen my land but trusted their president's judgment. The construction continued despite her best efforts, and by month 4, my cabin was really taking shape. The frame was up, the roof was on, and I'd started on the interior walls. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and well built. Exactly the kind of simple refuge I'd dreamed of having since I was a kid in a series of cramped apartments. Every board I nailed felt like a small victory against Margaret's campaign of harassment, and I could see her frustration growing as the cabin became harder to dismiss as a temporary eyesore. She started making darker threats on her live streams, talking about nuclear options and final solutions, with a gleam in her eye that made her followers uncomfortable enough to change the subject. That's when she played what she thought was her ace card. She somehow discovered that 20 years ago, there had been a clerical error when the property lines were redrawn, and for exactly 3 months, my 5 acres had technically been part of the Willowbrook HOA. The error had been corrected, the proper paperwork filed, and the previous owner had even received a refund for the 3 months of HOA dues he'd mistakenly paid. But Margaret seized on this technicality like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. She declared that any structures built on the property fell under the continuing jurisdiction clause in their bylaws. A piece of legal fiction so creative, it would have impressed a fantasy novelist. Her lawyer, a nervous man named Timothy Pearson, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, sent me a cease and desist letter that cited 17 different HOA regulations. My cabin supposedly violated. The list was absurd, including violations for architectural nonconformity, unauthorized habitat modification, and my personal favorite, aggressive non-participation in community standards. When I showed the letter to my own lawyer, she laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her chair, then charged me $200 to write a response that basically said no in the most legally bulletproof way possible. Margaret was not amused, and her live streams took on an increasingly unhinged quality as she promised her followers that justice would prevail. The security cameras I'd installed turned out to be worth every penny when they captured Margaret and 3 other HOA board members sneaking onto my property at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night. They weren't subtle about it, arriving in golf carts with the headlights on, apparently convinced that their HOA authority extended to criminal trespass. I watched in real time from my phone as they walked around my cabin, Margaret pointing at various violations, while one of her companions took notes on an official-looking clipboard. They spent 20 minutes documenting every perceived flaw, from the angle of my roof to the spacing of my deck boards, before Margaret produced something from her pocket that made my blood run cold, a red tag that said, "Condemned by order of Willowbrook HOA." I was out of my truck and running toward them before I'd even fully processed what was happening. They scattered like roaches when a light comes on, Margaret dropping her clipboard in her haste to get back to her golf cart. I managed to snap several photos of them fleeing and collected the clipboard as evidence. The papers attached to it were a treasure trove of incriminating information, including a draft press release announcing the emergency condemnation of my cabin due to immediate safety concerns, scheduled to be sent out the next morning. There was also a list of contractors who'd already been contacted about demolition, with start dates and pricing. They'd been planning this for weeks, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I spent the rest of the night preparing my counterattack. I edited the security footage into a highlight reel of their trespass, complete with timestamps and close-ups of their faces. I scanned every document from the dropped clipboard, creating a digital trail of their conspiracy. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I created my own social media accounts. By sunrise, I'd posted the entire story on every platform I could find, tagging local news stations, the state attorney general's office, and every civil rights organization within 100 miles. The video of 4 HOA board members sneaking around private property in the middle of the night went viral within hours, helped along by my provocative title, HOA President Breaks into My Property to Condemn Legal Cabin. Margaret's response was swift and predictable. She went live on her own channels, tears streaming down her face as she claimed I'd viciously attacked her when she was simply trying to protect the community from what she now called a dangerous structure. She showed bruises on her arms that definitely hadn't been there during our encounter, and told a harrowing tale of how I'd threatened her and her companions with violence if they didn't leave. Her followers were split between those who believed her unconditionally and those who pointed out that my security footage showed no such confrontation. The comments section became a battleground between truth and loyalty, with longtime supporters starting to question Margaret's version of events. The local news picked up the story by that afternoon, and suddenly my quiet construction project was the talk of 3 counties. Reporters showed up at my property and at Willowbrook's main gate, looking for comments from anyone willing to talk. Margaret tried to control the narrative by holding an impromptu press conference in front of the clubhouse, but it backfired spectacularly when a reporter asked why HOA board members were on private property at 2 in the morning. Her explanation that they were conducting a safety assessment fell apart when pressed for details about what made them qualified to assess structural safety or why it couldn't be done during normal hours with proper notice. That evening, I received a call from the FBI field office in Denver. The agent on the phone, Sarah Chen, explained that they'd received multiple reports about potential civil rights violations and abuse of authority in my case. She asked if I'd be willing to meet with her team to discuss the situation, and I agreed immediately. What I didn't know was that Margaret had also been in contact with federal authorities, spinning a tale about suspected drug activity and possible terrorism connections that she claimed my cabin was hiding. In her desperation to win, she'd crossed a line that would change everything. The meeting with Agent Chen and her team was scheduled for the next morning at 9 a.m. But Margaret had other plans. At exactly 8:45, as I was getting ready to leave for the FBI office, I heard vehicles approaching on my dirt road. Through my window, I saw 2 black SUVs and 3 Willowbrook security golf carts forming a convoy, with Margaret's white Mercedes bringing up the rear. My phone immediately buzzed with notifications as she went live, announcing to her followers that she was about to end this once and for all with the help of federal authorities. I grabbed my phone and the small digital recorder I'd bought after the trespassing incident, slipping it into my shirt pocket and activating it with a practiced motion. Something told me that whatever was about to happen, I'd want every word on record. As I stepped out onto my front porch, I made sure my security cameras had a clear view of the approaching vehicles and hit the record button on my phone as backup. The morning sun was just cresting the mountains, casting long shadows across my property as the convoy pulled to a stop in front of my cabin. Agent Chen stepped out of the lead SUV, and I could see immediately that something was wrong. Her expression was grim, and she held an official-looking document in her hand. Behind her, 3 other agents emerged, their hands resting on their weapons in a way that made my stomach drop. Margaret practically leaped out of her Mercedes, her phone already recording, as she strutted toward my cabin with the confidence of someone who thought they'd already won. She was dressed in a power suit that probably cost more than I'd spent on lumber, and her smile was so wide it looked painful. "Mr. Sterling," Agent Chen called out, her voice carrying across the morning air. "I need you to step away from the building and keep your hands where we can see them." My mind raced as I complied, moving slowly down the porch steps while keeping my hands visible. This wasn't how our meeting was supposed to go, and the presence of Margaret and her security team made even less sense. Unless... I glanced at Margaret, who was now narrating breathlessly to her phone about how the FBI was here to finally deal with the threat I posed to their community. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. She'd somehow manipulated the situation to turn our scheduled meeting into what looked like a raid. "Agent Chen," I said, keeping my voice calm, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I thought we were meeting at your office at 9. What's going on here?" She looked uncomfortable, glancing between me and Margaret before responding. "We received information last night about potential illegal structures and safety violations that required immediate attention. Mrs. Whitfield provided documentation suggesting this cabin was built on federal land without proper permits." Margaret's smile grew even wider as she zoomed her phone camera in on my face, no doubt capturing what she thought would be my moment of defeat. "That's interesting," I replied, reaching slowly for my pocket, "because I have documentation proving this is private property and that all permits were properly filed." "May I?" Agent Chen nodded, and I pulled out my phone, quickly navigating to the folder where I'd stored all my paperwork. "I also have security footage from last night showing Mrs. Whitfield and 3 other HOA board members trespassing on my property at 2 a.m., attempting to post fraudulent condemnation notices." Margaret's smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered, but I caught it on my phone camera, which was still recording everything. "Those are clearly doctored videos," Margaret announced loudly, making sure her live stream audience could hear. "This man has been harassing our community for months, building illegal structures and threatening anyone who questions him. Just last week, he assaulted me when I tried to discuss his violations." She pulled up her sleeve to show the bruises again, and I noticed they looked significantly darker than they had in yesterday's video. "I have 200 witnesses who can testify to his aggressive behavior and the danger he poses to our families." Agent Chen held up a hand for silence. Her trained investigator's eye moving between Margaret and me. Mrs. Whitfield, you told us this was federal land. Do you have documentation to support that claim? Margaret's confidence wavered slightly as she fumbled with her phone. It's all in the HOA archives. Timothy, show them the papers. She gestured imperiously at her lawyer, who had just arrived in another golf cart, looking even more miserable than usual. He approached slowly, clutching a manila folder like it might explode, and handed it to Agent Chen with shaking hands. As the agent reviewed the documents, I watched Margaret's face carefully. She was still live streaming, still narrating her version of events, but I could see the uncertainty creeping in around the edges of her perfectly made-up eyes. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I cleared my throat and spoke loudly enough for her phone to pick up every word. Mrs. Whitfield, while we're waiting, perhaps you could explain to your followers why you felt it necessary to offer the Wagner Construction Company $10,000 to refuse my building supply orders? Or why you paid that health inspector $500 to file a false report about hazardous waste on my property? The color drained from Margaret's face as her followers' comments exploded with questions and demands for explanation. She tried to lower her phone, but I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the morning air. I have the emails. Margaret, the ones where you discussed taking care of the Sterling problem, with methods that you yourself described as not strictly legal but necessary, the ones where you admitted that you knew I wasn't part of the HOA, but decided to make an example of me anyway, the ones where you told Timothy that if he didn't find a way to stop my construction, you'd make sure his wife found out about his gambling debts. Timothy made a strangled sound and took several steps backward, his face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and what looked like relief. Agent Chen looked up from the documents, her expression now focused entirely on Margaret. Mrs. Whitfield, these papers appear to be a collection of HOA bylaws and meeting minutes. I don't see any federal land designation or property disputes. What exactly is the basis for your claim? Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as she struggled to maintain her composure on camera. Her followers were now actively turning against her, the comment section filling with accusations and demands for the truth. That's when I played my ace. The small recorder in my pocket had been running the entire time, but what Margaret didn't know was that it wasn't just any recorder. It was connected via Bluetooth to a portable speaker system I'd installed in my truck after the trespassing incident. With a simple tap on my phone screen, Margaret's voice suddenly filled the air, crystal clear and undeniable. I don't care if he owns the land legally. That white trash piece of shit is ruining our property values just by existing. I'll bury him in so much legal harassment, he'll beg me to buy him out for pennies on the dollar. And if that doesn't work, well, I know people who can make problems disappear permanently. The recording continued, capturing a conversation between Margaret and an unknown male voice discussing prices for various forms of harassment, from slashed tires to planted evidence. The security guards who'd come with her began backing away, suddenly very interested in being anywhere else. Timothy actually ran for his golf cart, abandoning his client without a backward glance. Even Margaret's most loyal followers couldn't defend what they were hearing, and her livestream comments turned into a flood of shock and disgust as the full extent of her campaign became clear. Agent Chen's hand moved to her radio, and her voice was steel when she spoke. This is Chen. I need backup at the Sterling property immediately. We have a situation. She turned to Margaret, whose phone had dropped to her side, the live stream still running but forgotten. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and making false statements to federal agents. The look of absolute shock on Margaret's face as the handcuffs clicked into place was something I'd remember for the rest of my life. Her perfectly controlled world had crumbled in less than 5 minutes, brought down by her own hubris and the technology she'd used to harass me for months. As two agents led Margaret to their SUV, she found her voice one last time, screaming about lawsuits and connections and how I'd regret this. Her phone lay forgotten on the ground, still live streaming to thousands of viewers who were witnessing the complete destruction of her reputation in real time. The comments had turned into a celebration, with former victims of her HOA tactics sharing their own stories and thanking me for finally exposing her. Someone had already started a number, Justice for Connor hashtag, that was spreading across social media like wildfire. Agent Chen approached me as the chaos settled, her expression professional but not unsympathetic. "Mr. Sterling, we'll need a full statement from you, and copies of all your evidence. The recording equipment in your pocket, was that intentional?" I nodded, pulling out the small device and handing it over. After months of harassment, I learned to document everything. I never thought it would lead to this, but I couldn't let her destroy everything I'd worked for. She studied me for a moment before speaking. "You showed remarkable restraint. Most people would have retaliated long before this. Your patience in gathering evidence properly is what made this possible." As the federal vehicles pulled away with Margaret in custody, I noticed something ironic. Her live stream was still running from her abandoned phone, now pointed at the sky, but still capturing audio. The viewer count had climbed to over 50,000, and the comments were a mixture of shock at what they'd witnessed and plans to reform the Willowbrook HOA from the ground up. Several board members were already announcing their resignations, and someone had started a petition to dissolve the current HOA structure entirely. The organization Margaret had used as a weapon was crumbling without her iron fist to hold it together. I picked up her phone, turning it to face me as I addressed her audience one last time. "For 6 months, I just wanted to build a cabin on my own land. What happened here today didn't have to happen. But some people think power gives them the right to destroy others. Today, you saw what happens when someone fights back with truth instead of violence, with evidence instead of threats. I hope Willowbrook can heal from this and become the community it always should have been, one that welcomes neighbors instead of attacking them." I ended the stream and set the phone aside for the police to collect as evidence. As the morning sun climbed higher, I stood in front of my cabin and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The structure that Margaret had tried so hard to destroy stood strong and solid, a testament to perseverance in the face of persecution. But even as I celebrated this victory, I knew the story wasn't over. Margaret's arrest was just the beginning of what would likely be a long legal process, and there were still questions to be answered about how deep the corruption in Willowbrook went. My phone was already ringing with calls from reporters, lawyers, and civil rights organizations, all wanting to know more about what had just transpired. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, and I realized more law enforcement was on the way. Whether they were coming to secure the crime scene, gather more evidence, or deal with new revelations from Margaret's arrest, I couldn't be sure. What I did know was that my quiet dream of building a simple cabin had turned into something much bigger, a fight for justice that would ripple through the community for years to come. As I walked back toward my cabin to wait for whatever came next, I couldn't help but smile at the thought that Margaret's own weapons, her cameras, her live streams, her obsessive documentation, had been turned against her in the end. Sometimes the best revenge really is just letting someone reveal their true self to the world. The media circus that descended on Willowbrook Estates over the next 72 hours made Margaret's live streams look like home videos. News vans lined the main road, reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and my cabin became the most photographed structure in Colorado. I spent most of that time with FBI agents and prosecutors, going through every piece of evidence I'd collected over 6 months. What started as a personal dispute had uncovered a web of corruption that went far deeper than anyone imagined. Agent Chen's team found records of Margaret extorting over $300,000 from residents through fabricated fines and illegal assessments. money that had been funneled into offshore accounts under her maiden name. The first domino to fall after Margaret was Timothy Pearson, her lawyer who'd spent years helping her craft legally dubious threats against homeowners. He showed up at my door the morning after her arrest, looking like he hadn't slept in days, and clutching a banker's box full of files. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to make things right. What Margaret had on me, it wasn't worth what I helped her do to people. These are all her real files. The ones she thought I was too stupid to copy. Every illegal eviction, every forged document, every bribe to city officials. It's all here." The box contained enough evidence to put Margaret away for decades and implicated 6 other HOA board members in crimes ranging from fraud to witness intimidation. By the end of the first week, the Willowbrook HOA had effectively ceased to exist. The remaining board members resigned en masse rather than face investigation, and an emergency meeting of homeowners voted to dissolve the organization entirely. The community that had lived in fear of Margaret's rules suddenly found themselves free to paint their doors any color they wanted, park their cars facing any direction, and display holiday decorations without getting permission forms signed in triplicate. It was like watching a communist state collapse in real time. With residents celebrating freedoms they'd forgotten they'd lost. Someone even organized a "Burn Your HOA Handbook" party in the common area. Though the fire department made them use a metal drum for safety, the investigation revealed that my case was just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret had systematically targeted anyone she saw as beneath the Willowbrook standard, which primarily meant anyone who wasn't white, wealthy, and willing to kiss her ring. The Patel family had been driven out because they'd hung prayer flags during Diwali. The Johnsons lost their home over manufactured violations after Mr. Pensiondations, the Ruvels/. Johnson had the audacity to question the HOA budget at a meeting. Maria Gonzalez had been fined into bankruptcy because Margaret claimed her children's laughter violated noise ordinances. Each story was more heartbreaking than the last, and many of these families joined a class-action lawsuit that would eventually see Margaret's personal assets liquidated to pay restitution. 3 weeks after the arrest, I got an unexpected visitor. Harold Whitfield, Margaret's ex-husband, pulled up in a modest Honda Civic, a far cry from the luxury cars he'd driven during their marriage. He looked like a different person, younger somehow, despite his gray hair, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I wanted to apologize," he said, standing awkwardly at my door. I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I was too weak to stop her. She had me convinced I was nothing without her, that I'd be homeless if I ever stood up to her. It took seeing you fight back to realize I'd been living in a prison of my own making. He handed me a USB drive containing recorded conversations between Margaret and various co-conspirators, evidence he'd been secretly gathering for years but had been too frightened to use. The contents of Harold's USB drive broke the case wide open. There were recordings of Margaret discussing plans to plant drugs in residents' cars if they opposed her, bribing health inspectors to cite home-based businesses that competed with her friends' companies, and most damning, a conversation with a former police chief about making assault charges disappear after she'd attacked a homeowner who dared to display a political sign she disagreed with. The FBI expanded their investigation to include public corruption charges, and suddenly half the city council was hiring lawyers. The police chief retired overnight, citing health concerns that seemed to have developed the moment the recordings went public. As the legal proceedings ground on, something beautiful began happening in Willowbrook. Without Margaret's iron-fisted control, neighbors started actually talking to each other. The Smiths discovered that the Browns shared their passion for astronomy and started hosting stargazing parties. The elderly Mrs. Chen began teaching cooking classes in the community center that had previously been reserved for HOA board meetings. Children played freely in the common areas without their parents worrying about grass height violations. It was as if the entire community had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. The transformation was so dramatic that property values actually increased. Contrary to everything Margaret had preached about the necessity of strict control, my cabin became an unofficial symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny. People drove from neighboring states to take pictures with it, and I lost count of how many times I heard, "You inspired me to fight back against my HOA," from visitors. Someone started selling "Build Cabins, Not Barriers" t-shirts online, with proceeds going to families who'd been displaced by aggressive HOAs. I even got a call from a documentary filmmaker wanting to tell the story, though I turned him down because I'd had enough of cameras for a lifetime. The attention was overwhelming for someone who just wanted to build a quiet retreat, but I understood that my story had become bigger than just me and my cabin. 6 months after Margaret's arrest, I attended her sentencing hearing. The federal courthouse was packed with her victims, some traveling hundreds of miles to see justice served. Margaret, who'd once strutted around Willowbrook like royalty, now sat hunched at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her perfect hair now showing gray roots. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Hawkins, listened to 2 days of victim impact statements with growing disgust. When it came time for sentencing, she didn't mince words. "Mrs. Whitfield, you turned what should have been a community organization into a criminal enterprise. You destroyed lives, bankrupted families, and violated the civil rights of hundreds of people, all to feed your own ego and bank account. The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release." Margaret's reaction was everything her victims had hoped for. She sobbed, begged, promised to make amends, and even tried to blame her actions on mental illness, childhood trauma, and hormone imbalances, but Judge Hawkins wasn't moved. "Your tears now don't erase the tears of the families you destroyed. Your promises now don't rebuild the homes you stole. Your excuses now don't resurrect the dreams you killed. This sentence stands, and may it serve as a warning to anyone else who thinks they can use positions of small authority to act as tyrants." The courtroom erupted in applause before the bailiff could call for order, and I saw more than one person wiping away tears of relief. With Margaret gone and the HOA dissolved, I thought things would finally quiet down. But the universe had one more surprise in store. While researching property records for the documentary filmmaker I'd rejected, a local historian made a shocking discovery. The land my cabin sat on wasn't just any 5 acres. It was the original homestead of Jonathan Willow, the founder of what eventually became Willowbrook Estates. Hidden in the county archives was his original will, which included a provision that the homestead land could never be incorporated into any homeowners association or development corporation. Margaret had known this all along, which explained her desperate attempts to drive me away. If the truth had come out during her reign, it would have invalidated the HOA's claim to several $1 million worth of common area land that actually belonged to my property. The revelation led to a complex legal settlement that took another year to resolve. In the end, I found myself the owner of not just my original 5 acres, but an additional 15 acres that included the community center, 2 parks, and ironically, the lot where Margaret's own house had stood before it was seized as proceeds of crime. I could have made millions selling it back to the residents, but that felt wrong. Instead, I worked with a team of lawyers to establish the Willowbrook Community Trust, a nonprofit organization that would maintain the common areas for all residents without the authoritarian structure of an HOA. The board was elected democratically. Term limits were strictly enforced, and every rule required a 75% vote of all residents to pass. The transformation of Willowbrook, from an HOA dictatorship to a genuine community, became a case study for neighborhoods across the country. Law schools invited me to speak about property rights and civil resistance. Civil rights organizations used our story to push for HOA reform legislation. 3 states passed laws limiting HOA power based on what had happened to us. It was surreal to see my simple desire for a cabin turn into a nationwide movement, but I realized that thousands of people had been waiting for someone to prove that these petty tyrants could be defeated. Margaret had unknowingly chosen the wrong person at the right time, and her downfall sparked a revolution in how Americans thought about community governance. 2 years after that fateful morning when the FBI arrived at my door, I hosted a celebration at my cabin. The guest list included Agent Chen, who'd become a friend after the case concluded, Harold Whitfield, who'd found happiness managing a small charity, Timothy Pearson, who'd rebuilt his law practice helping HOA abuse victims, and dozens of Willowbrook residents who'd become like family. We barbecued, shared stories, and watched the sunset from the deck Margaret had tried so hard to prevent me from building. Someone had brought a piñata, shaped like an HOA handbook, and watching the children beat it open while their parents cheered felt like the perfect metaphor for how far we'd come. As the party wound down, I found myself alone on my porch, the same spot where I'd stood when Agent Chen had arrived that morning 2 years ago. The cabin that had caused so much trouble stood solid and welcoming, a testament to the power of standing your ground when you know you're right. The security cameras were still there, but now they mostly captured deer wandering through the yard and the occasional curious tourist. The fence that had separated my property from Willowbrook had been torn down by mutual agreement, creating a seamless blend between my land and the community that had once rejected me. It wasn't the quiet retreat I'd originally envisioned, but somehow it had become something better, a symbol that ordinary people could stand up to bullies and win. My phone buzzed with a message from a homeowner in Texas who was facing similar harassment from her HOA. She'd seen my story online and wanted advice on how to fight back. As I typed out a response, offering to connect her with resources and lawyers who specialized in these cases, I realized this was my life now. The cabin builder had become an accidental activist, helping others stand up to the Margaret Whitfields of the world. It wasn't the retirement I'd planned, but watching communities break free from authoritarian control was more satisfying than any quiet retreat could have been. The final irony came when I received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Margaret had written from her cell, not to apologize but to inform me that she was writing a book about her experience and wanted to interview me for accuracy. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity, the same trait that had led to her downfall still burning bright behind bars. I declined, of course, but kept the letter as a reminder that some people never learn. Her book would eventually be published, a delusional manifesto that portrayed her as a victim of conspiracy. But it sold poorly and was largely mocked by reviewers who knew the real story. 5 years later, my cabin still stands. Now with a few additions including a guest house where visiting HOA refugees can stay while fighting their own battles. The walls are covered with photos and letters from people across the country who've successfully challenged abusive HOAs, each one a small victory in the larger war for property rights and human dignity. Margaret serves her time in federal prison, where rumor has it, she's tried to establish an inmate council with strict rules about cell decoration and commissary purchases. Old habits die hard, but at least now her victims can simply request a transfer rather than lose their homes. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Margaret had simply left me alone to build my cabin in peace. Would she still be running Willowbrook with an iron fist? Would hundreds of families still be living in fear of their next violation notice? Would Timothy still be helping her forge documents while Harold suffered in silence? In trying to destroy one man's simple dream, Margaret had exposed her own corruption and freed an entire community from tyranny. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can topple the mightiest oppressors, and that building a cabin with your own hands can be the most revolutionary act of all. The story ends where it began, with me on my porch, watching the sun rise through the trees, breathing free air on my own land. The difference is that now I'm not alone. The community that once shunned me has become family. The cabin that caused so much conflict has become a landmark, and the fight that nearly broke me has given purpose to my life. Margaret thought she could crush my dream because she had power and I had nothing. She was wrong. I had the truth, the patience to document it, and the courage to stand my ground. In the end, that was more than enough to bring down a tyrant and free a community. And if it could happen here, in one small corner of Colorado, it can happen anywhere that people decide they've had enough of petty dictators and their made-up rules.